Hello, everybody. Bert Copeland with New Life CFO Services, and thanks a ton for carving out the time of your day, which I know is very busy, to spend some time with us in parts of our educational forum. Today, we're going to drive into your P&L. Over time, what we have found is that while entrepreneurs love their P&L, they don't really understand the depth of what their P&L is trying to tell them about their business and how to weaponize their P&L to drive performance. So that's what we're going to do today, allowing you to understand your P&L to drive performance. We call this lessons from the Shark Tank. Now, one of the precepts that we throw out there is, are your numbers really ready for the Shark Tank, or are you just chumming the water? And when I say that, hopefully you've been watching the Shark Tank, as I have for years. And if you have, you know that at the Shark Tank, there's one issue that comes up a lot that the sharks really get almost upset about. And that issue is for the entrepreneurs, like, you don't know your numbers, or you really don't know what your numbers are telling you about your own business, that you have blind spots that a really better user or sophisticated user of financials could readily see that you don't. So this is just step one in diving into that. And as we go through this, I want you to keep a list of questions that you take back to your accountant, your controller, your CFO to really drive this understanding. And of course, we're happy if you bring those questions back to us. You can go on our website, click on it for a free consultation, and we're happy to go through that with you. With that said, let's get started. So one important concept about your numbers when you're looking at them, it's not my numbers are better or worse than how they used to be. It's really that your numbers are telling you about this concept that your financials, they're nothing but a historical reflection of your people, their decisions, their behaviors, your processes, and your systems. So when you look at your financials, I want you to then say, what is this telling me about my people, their behaviors, their decisions, my processes, and my systems? Because I will almost guarantee you that irrespective of your great strategic plans, that if you can't use your financials to help educate your people and help change their decision behaviors, the odds of you getting to your strategic plan are slim and none. Okay? And in fact, we believe that one of the highest and best use of your CFO is to be the Chief Financial Education Officer, not only to you, but everybody in your company, including the people in the trenches. If you can help to get those people to understand how their behaviors and decisions affect the financials and affect their ability to earn a bonus, boy, is that a magical route to take. So as we start out, there's this concept, the road less stupid, and the concept is the dumb tax. And here we're going to ask, how big is your dumb tax? Now you're probably asking me, what is the dumb tax? So that's a good question. Let's go there. The dumb tax is a premise about, if you look back in your business career, what are the most costly mistakes that you ever made? Right? For me, those are 7-figure mistakes that I've made. 7-figure. Like, my wife would be wildly happier if I hadn't stepped in those landmines. And then ask yourself, would I have made the same mistakes if I had better information, better data, or understood that data better about what it's telling me about my people and my company? What I love here is this saying here is within the book, I don't need to do more smart things. I just need to do fewer dumb things. I need to avoid making the emotional decisions and swinging at bad pitches. I just need to think. So I encourage you to get this book because it really drills into this concept, but it also drills into a concept of thinking time. Purposefully setting aside a block of time in your calendar that is protected come hell or high water for you to step aside and quietly reflect what's going on in your business and what is the information about your business telling you about whether you're on track and off track and what to do about it. If nothing else out of this presentation, you will thank me for recommending this book. So let's continue. First and foremost, you need to understand what your financials are really telling you. Your income statement, it's your speedometer. How fast are you going? Are you going 5 miles an hour? Are you going 10 miles an hour? Are you going 50 miles an hour? And if you have a really good budget, you'll know that, hey, I'm going 40 miles an hour at a time that I thought I'd be going 50 miles an hour. So knowing those comparisons allows you to ask why or why not. Your balance sheet, it just tells you how healthy the body is. Can you maintain that pace in which your income statement is telling you how fast you are? How long can you maintain that pace and stay in the race? Back in the day, I used to run marathons, and I'll tell you, not only is in business your balance sheet the most important part, but that fuel to drive your speed is also the most important part in a marathon race, right? So I use that metaphor a lot because I hit the wall when I ran out of juice, and I've also done really well when I was properly prepared. Preparedness comes in the balance sheet. Your statement of cash flows, which 95% of y'all have never seen, looked at, or understood, really connects that dot between my EBITDA that I love and the amount of cash that I earned that month. I'll get questions all the time about, my gosh, my income statement shows that I made $500,000 this month, but my cash balance went down. Something must be wrong. Somebody's stealing money from me. Well, what's really stealing money from you is your balance sheet. Not managing your balance sheet is the number one way to almost certainly run out of cash. But today we're focused on the income statement, so let's get focused. This is the typical income statement. Yes, I know it looks like a sandwich, but I'm telling you it's the income statement. And I came up with this metaphor because when I asked entrepreneurs, what do you look at when you look at your financials? The first two things are revenue and EBITDA, or revenue and net income. The third is usually cash balances, and the fourth might be my gross margin. But let's stay with 1 and 2 for a second. My revenue and my EBITDA. Well, that's the same thing as this sandwich on the left. You have the top piece of bread and the bottom piece of bread, and that's all you're looking at to determine if you're okay. But how many of y'all ever bought a sandwich because of 2 pieces of bread and nothing in between? There's not a whole lot of flavor there. That's certainly not worth paying money for. However, the sandwich on the right, that looks like a good sandwich. Juicy, flavorful, lots of stuff going on. And that's your income statement. The revenue and the EBITDA are interesting, but it's all the stuff in between that's really makes the sandwich, your P&L, tasty. It makes those things work well together. Do you have enough mayonnaise? Do you want more or less tomato? I'm not really a big tomato guy, but you might be. It's that part that really makes your P&L very interesting, and that's where we're going to go today. We're not going to go super deep, but we are going to give you enough information to understand how your P&L should be organized to drive behavior in your company. So first and foremost, your P&L or your financial statements are the tip of the iceberg. They are just the very top level of information to tell you what's going on in your company. And like any iceberg, they're showing you about 10%, 5% of the total data. Everything else is underneath. Why is that important? Well, a good financial statement, like a good iceberg, the top part should tell you where things are right or wrong and where to go look for more. So it's not just, are your financials okay? What it should tell you is what decisions need to be made. Based upon what you see in the top part of your financials, you should have a good idea about what's working, what's not, and how to go ask bigger questions. So here's a different way of looking at your P&L along this deal. Don't think of it as a P&L. Think of it as a decision tree, right? Let that sink in for a second. Your P&L is structured to be a decision tree. If this is okay, or if this is broken, then it's either X or Y. And then you can kind of keep on coming down depending on these indicators of what's working and what's not working. As you look at this, you're like, boy, this guy is not very smart because he has gross profit at the top of his iceberg. That's not a mistake. Gross profit's the most important thing. Revenue may be the thing that's jacking up your gross profit. So I start out with gross profit because it's driven a lot of times by the quality of my revenue. And then we can get into the mix and pricing of my revenue, or the COGS between labor and the product cost. But as you start to think about your P&L as a decision tree, you will start to ask better questions. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to be equipped to ask better questions. In fact, there's a couple of books out there that great leaders ask great questions. So next time you look at your P&L, I want you to think about and step back and go, what does this really tell me about the questions I should be asking? What's working? What's not working? What's broken? What's really working well? And when you do that, then you can start to center on accountability, on driving performance. But you have to be able to have enough insight to ask those questions. So here's the first questions that you should be asking. It's a concept that we talk about all the time here at New Life. Not all revenues are created equally. You know, it's good news and bad news that entrepreneurs are hyper competitive, but the number one country club bragging point is revenue. How much? How much more than last year? How fast is it growing and everything else? But I'm telling you, revenue can be the most dangerous thing to be thinking about because not all revenue is created equally. For example, my old business was commercial construction. And 90% of my revenues were lumpy transactions for bid work that I won. That's not very valuable revenue. However, I also had a service branch to where about 10% of my revenues were service contracts to take care of those floors that we'd installed. Now, some of y'all may or may not know, but lumpy revenues are only worth a fraction of what recurring contractual revenues are. In fact, these revenues are worth almost 7 times more than this. Why is that? Well, number one, these transactional revenues over here have to be recreated all the time. These keep on going and going, and so you can build layers upon layers upon layers. They're sustainable, repeatable, buildable revenues. These are transaction revenues that have to be recreated every year. And in fact, my business, for the project side, literally every January, my revenue started out at zero. Zero. Had to be entirely recreated every year, which is painful. So if you're growing revenue and you had the choice to grow these contractual recurring revenues versus these lumpy project revenues, see what you can do over here first. Because not only are those a good place to invest, they're much more valuable if you go to sell your company. And because they are ongoing, you can build efficiencies in there, which gets me back down to my favorite thing on the P&L, gross margin. Right? So look at your revenues and view it as far as which one of these really drives more sustainable, repeatable gross margins that I can manage up. Right? That's the most important thing. So hopefully on your P&L, you can see different types of revenue right on the face of your P&L. As you look at your revenues, on this side is the low risk, high value revenues. It could be contract services. It could be subscriptions. In my case, I had maintenance agreements. Those were very valuable contracts because my ability to repeat. So if I got run over by a bus, those revenues are still ongoing. On the other side of my salesperson, number one salesperson got run over by a bus, I was in deep, deep trouble because she drove 1/3 of my revenues. As we go further and further to the right-hand side and we get over to reoccurring revenues, which could be consumables or projects on a large install base. And when I say that, I want you to think about like when cell towers were first being built. It took 10 years to build out that thing. So while they were project-based deal, there was one project after another, year after year after year. My old company was right there in project revenues. So now we're talking about the high risk, low value because they had to be repeated and rebuilt and restructured every year. The least valuables are when you have concentration risk. We literally had one customer who 80% of their business was with one customer. It's like, oh my gosh, you really don't have a company. You have a great job that nobody else wants because you are one decision maker away from being out of business. Like you could not change your cost structure fast enough to survive if that happened. Ultimately, through that awareness and great planning and initiatives, refocused the company to build their other revenue streams. And by the time they sold the company, that one customer was down to 40, 45% of total revenue, which was A huge change. It was still way more than 25, right? But it kind of dictated where they could sell their company to. But going from 80 down to 40, 45 was a huge improvement. Not as much as it could be, but still a huge improvement. But always remember, as you're looking at these buckets of revenue, what margins are they creating? Higher margin revenues are much more valuable than lower margin revenues. It's a lower risk, right? So think about margins also in another way. Margins dictate your culture. So you're like, how can margins dictate my culture? Well, if I have margins of 65, 60%, I can stub my toe and everything's still okay, because I have a lot of cushion to correct what's down below. But if my margins are 25, 20, 18%, I can't stub my toe at all. Those little bitty errors and issues in my company are very painful down to my net income. Because especially if you want a net income of 10% plus, it means that I could only have very small issues and still even survive to keep that 10%. So that makes it even higher risk. So how does that impact culture? Well, if I have high margins and I stub my toe, well, that's just a learning event. We all back up, we learn from it, we dissect it, we improve our processes and go forward. If I have really low margins and I stub my toe, or worse yet, really step in a bear trap, that's catastrophic. So my company has to be very autocratic in how it manages its processes, looking over people's shoulders, detailed step-by-step procedures that nobody's allowed to vary from. On their side, a lot more flexibility, a lot more people-centric. We're here to learn and build off each other. So be careful about the margins that you allow in your company, because margins will ultimately dictate your culture. So when you're looking at this P&L, we have purposely broken out between standard and private label and other revenue. Now I'm going to ask you to ignore the other revenue for a second, because that's really rebates, discounts, and things like that. So we're not going to talk about that right now. But between the standard products and the private label, why did we separate those? Well, we separated those because they have significantly different margins between the two. And in fact, in most companies, private label is a lower margin item because the customer is doing all the promotions. But for this company, it was their highest margin items. And their standard products under their own brand were a lower margin item. Now, with that in mind, that their highest margin items were private label, let's look at how fast they're growing. The private label business grew 104% year over year. That's fantastic. Their highest margin items are growing the fastest, which means they are building a company that is more valuable because they're focused on the margins that are created, not just the revenues that are created. So if I went down here and I was just looking at total revenue and grew 47%, I'd be really happy. But I'll tell you, if that 47% growth came from the standard versus the private label, I wouldn't be nearly as happy. And we're going to see why in just a little bit. Now over here, common size, what percent of my revenues is private label versus the standard? That's a good indicator, because if I grew 100%, that means that last year my private label was only 13% of my revenue mix, and now it's 27%. I show that to an investor, that my highest margin products are now growing significantly and an increase in part of my mix. That investor, that possible buyer, is now very interested. It also creates accountability here for my marketing team. What are we doing to drive more volume in our high margin items? And this is exactly where not all revenue is created equally. I don't want to grow all my revenue equally in this case. I want to grow my high margin stuff, because for every dollar that I grow, more money falls to the bottom line. Now, as I go down into cost of sales, you will see that I've categorized things between direct labor, direct material, and other. Other in this case is packaging and freight. And we're going to stay on direct labor and direct materials. Now, why do I classify those? Here's why. Accountability. So when you're reviewing your financials, there's probably your buyer, your procurement person that has direct responsibility over negotiating with vendors and contracts over the direct materials. How well are they doing? Are they doing a job to drive incremental profitability? So would you know that off the top of your head? Here's how. If I look at my total revenues, they're growing by 47%. My direct materials are growing by 46%. They're growing more slowly than my revenues. Therefore, my person who's buying out my products, who's buying out my packaging and all that other stuff, is doing a really good job here. Let's go up to labor. Labor's growing at 48%, where my revenues are growing 47%. A little bit of a leakage there, a little bit. But some of that in this case was actually driven by overtime to fulfill orders that were exceeding expectations. But also there's somebody in the room that is accountable and responsible for managing labor. So now I have not only for the person that's responsible for labor, I can show them their number. I could probably have a budget line in here as well with these same percentages that says, are we on track for budget? Yes or no. If the answer is no, what are you going to do to correct that problem and come back with a planned solution to change the direction of that number? This is how your P&L drives accountability. You start aligning your numbers with the people and responsibilities in the room. Now you have visibility, now you have ownership, now you have accountability. And when you have that, you can ask honestly, hey Joe, when we meet next month, I need you to come back with the 3 initiatives that you're going to launch and the priorities in which you're going to launch them to change that number to get back on track. And then Joe, tell me how long it's going to take to get back on track. We do the same thing down on what I call your operating expenses, which is sales and marketing, employment expenses, administrative, that's discretionary, that's cut off, and then fixed and facility expenses. Now, why do we group those expenses? There's 50 line items actually below all these. Why do we group them like that? It's for accountability, right? Because you probably have a sales manager in your business. And so if I'm looking at my marketing and sales, they own that number, right? They own that number. And now I can look at that line relative to my revenues and ask questions about how productive is my sales and marketing efforts? To answer that question, just as a basic, we can go down here, hey, I'm spending a third more on marketing and sales efforts, commissions, and everything else. I'll move my salespeople up to this line, so I want to see sales compensation, commissions up here, as well as my marketing spend, all up here because I want to see the productivity of it. And then I'll look up here at my revenues and go, okay, my marketing and sales expenses are growing by 33%, but our revenues are growing by 47%. So far that's a good number. That's a good relationship. And as I separate these lines out here, some of y'all have heard of customer acquisition cost. Well, if I'm in a business in which I have layers of revenue and I want to get the next layer, I can start calculating my customer acquisition cost. A very important metric to know as you're going through it. In fact, it's a great metric to ascertain, am I getting a great ROI on my marketing and sales expense? So again, accountability, because if those things were off track, I can ask the leader of my sales and marketing team, what's really not working? Where are we spending money that is not being productive? Is it a matter of timing that some of the initiatives that we started or were expected and planned not to drive new revenues for X, Y, or Z months? That's okay as long as we know that time frame. Then we can ask, is that time frame going to happen or not? But if they're really off track, then we can get back into what's broken, how are you going to fix it, when does it get fixed, and when does that fix show up in our numbers? Accountability and ownership. I do the G&A and headcount, this employment separately, because headcount's the number one expense that you have that you control in a heartbeat. It's also a productivity measure. How are we doing on our headcount versus what we're going on to operate the company? One of my favorite metrics there is revenue per head. Right? It's a great metric to manage. Are we growing our headcount faster than we're growing our revenue? Are we slow to cut our headcount when revenues are coming down? So keep that in mind. And if you want to learn more about how to use this as a key management tool, give us a holler. We'll be glad to sit down and talk to you about this and a few other key metrics for managing your P&L at the end of this. And then lastly, discretionary, that's going to be insurance, bank fees, things of that nature. It could be some of your training programs, etc. Some of this is discretionary and some of it's just the administrative part of operating your business. And then we get down to fixed and facility expenses. Those are down there at the bottom because they're very hard to change. Like if you're not performing, don't look there because it could cost you a bundle to change those items. You want to get out of your lease? Well, you're going to have to pay somebody a fortune to get out of your lease. You need to move your building? That's going to be expensive too. So that's not where you're going to save money. So as we come on down here to operating profit, boy, did this company do well. They went from a loss of $61,000 to making $590,000. That's fantastic. Is it? Let's see. So let's go back up to the quality of our revenue. There's a big question that says, if the revenue had grown, but it had all grown in the standard product versus the private label, would they have been profitable? The answer is no. No, they wouldn't have been profitable. The same level of growth at 47%, if it was all in the standard product versus the high margin private label product, they could have grown by this 47% on revenue and not been profitable. That's why the quality of revenue is very, very important. Now, as you look at this, especially the operating income, they grew $650,000 year over year in EBITDA. That sounds fantastic. But is it? Because there's one number on here that really still makes me very queasy. Guess which one it is? It's that one. They're still at only 2% profitability, and that's not very good. 2% profitability means you're that close to being unprofitable in a high-risk business because you're trying to support now $29 million worth of activity, and all you're producing is 2%. So we all know that growth consumes cash, right? So in this case, this company grew by 47%, but only produced 2% of incremental profitability. So if growth consumes cash, and I'll change that to growth consumes capital, where does the capital come from? Well, it comes from really only one of three sources. You earn it, in this case only 2%, or you borrow it from a bank, or you have investors that provide it. There's a fourth that means you can harvest it out of your balance sheet, but we're going to save that for our second conversation. But here's the universal truth. If you're only making 2% of net income, as you see here, a bank doesn't want to lend you money because you're not making enough. An investor doesn't want to give you any money because you're not making enough unless you're willing to give up a boatload of your equity for them to control and change the company. So while this is much better year over year, it ain't nearly good enough. Not nearly good enough. So think about that. Not only are you doing better, but now what things you have to do to try and get that 2%. So here's the best exercise that we've ever come up to do that. Yes, this looks really weird. But what I want you to do is if you're really only making this 2% of net income, turn your income statement upside down. Show everybody that we're still only making 2% and then ask the question, what do we have to change in our business to take 2% to 8 or 10%? Whatever the benchmark is for your company. So let's start out with the industry average benchmark. Maybe a year later you can ask, let's go to the upper quartile, but first let's just get to average. And here's the caveat. When you ask that company, what do we have to change to get to 2%, you allow them to change everything in the world except for one thing, volume. You cannot sell your way out of this problem. Because what 2% tells you is you still have a troubled or fragile operating structure. So there's no reason to put more transactions, more weight on a fragile structure, right? I want you to solve for the 8% before you start going to growth. So it's a really important exercise. Now I will tell you there's one thing about revenue you can change. You can change the mix. I'm a big fan of that. Let's change the mix. Let's keep on moving towards the private label versus the standard. That's okay. Total volume's the same, but we're shifting the mix. Great answer. You could also change your pricing, but you're not changing total volume. You're not selling your way out of this. You can change the mix, you can increase prices, but you can't change the total volume. then it forces you into what is our productive capacity on each one of these levels of expenses. When you start asking your people those questions and they can't change volume, you're going to get different answers. So I really hope that this has been helpful for you as you've gone through all this. And before we leave, I want to touch base on some of our favorite metrics for you to consider. Revenue composition and concentration. We've talked a lot about that in this little presentation. Revenue per head and how to use that to make sure that you're not throwing bodies at problems and that you're scaling your business appropriately. A lot of times you'll see people going, we're going to grow tremendously. I'm going to go hire 15 more people. Hire on a disciplined scale because it's frequent that people overhire relative to their planned revenue versus their real revenue. And then gross profit dollars per unit or as far as admin per head. Those are really good metrics. Direct labor and direct materials percent of revenue, we can help you understand how to manage those differently than perhaps what you've thought about before. Break-even point. If you don't understand how to measure and use break-even point to drive your business, definitely give us a call. We'll walk you through it because break-even incorporates my revenue, my margins, and my cost structure into one metric. And the lower your break-even point is, the better and healthier your company is because it means that I don't have to sell as much to make the same amount of money. Customer acquisition cost or sales and marketing as percent of revenue. And then for those of you that have project-based revenue, I want you to start thinking about number of months of revenue that are in your backlog, right? So in my business, I would always want 4 months of revenue in my backlog, awarded work that I had not started yet. Because my sales cycle was 3 months. And if I had 4 months, I was always okay. If it went down to 3 months, I'm going to start buying jobs and getting them off the street so I can rebuild that and have cushion. Happy to walk you through all these metrics and how to weaponize them to drive performance within your company and to drive accountability. So with that, I hope you'll reach out to us with any questions and comments that you have. We're happy to spend some time with you. No harm, no foul, no commitment, just to explore the questions and answers that this quick presentation may have risen for you. With that, y'all have a great day, and thanks for spending your time with us.